It was a small plastic inhaler, the kind used by someone with asthma, a routine, personal item. And it was sitting inside a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, a farm that had no connection to the woman it belonged to. That inhaler was traced to one of the women who had gone missing from Vancouver's Downtown Eastside. Police had received tips about this property for years, reports that women were going in and not coming out, reports that were logged and largely set aside. But this inhaler was physical, traceable. It connected a missing woman directly to a 17-acre farm. Once that link was confirmed, the investigation that followed became one of the largest forensic operations in Canadian history. And the story it uncovered was one that Canada had failed to see for far too long. Port Coquitlam is a suburb 17 miles east of Vancouver, quiet, tree-lined, and entirely unremarkable to most who passed through it. Canadians knew it mainly as the hometown of distance runner Terry Fox, but on its outer edge, at 953 Dominion Avenue, sat a 17-acre pig farm that had been in the Pickton family for 3 generations. From the road, it looked like a working rural property. Up close, the smell and scale of the operation made it something else entirely. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24, 1949, the second of 3 children. The household he was raised in bore almost no resemblance to an ordinary domestic environment. Court documents described a home in severe disorder, garbage throughout the living spaces, animal waste present inside the dwelling, and the boundary between family home and livestock operation almost non-existent. Neighbors who visited in those years described conditions that stayed with them long afterward. His mother Louise was described by those who knew the family as volatile and domineering. Robert never developed the basic skills of ordinary social interaction. At school, he was an outsider from the first day. His clothes carried the smell of the farm. Other children kept their distance or were openly hostile. He had no close friendships outside his brother David. He eventually dropped out of school entirely and returned to the one place that made sense to him, the farm and the daily physical work it demanded. His mother Louise died in 1979. His father Leonard died in 1984. Their sister Linda took her inheritance and left. The property passed to Robert and David. In the mid-1990s, something unexpected happened. The family sold off significant portions of Vancouver area landholdings as the city expanded around them. The sale generated over 5 million Canadian dollars. Robert Pickton, a man who had spent his life at the margins of every social group he had encountered, suddenly had money. And money changed who came to see him. In 1996, Robert and David Pickton registered a non-profit organization with the Canadian government called the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. The farm began hosting events that grew quickly in scale, drawing up to 2,000 people, bikers, party-goers, and significant numbers of women traveling out from Vancouver's Downtown Eastside for the night. Alcohol and other substances moved freely. Entry was open. The gatherings were not quiet or concealed. Local law enforcement was broadly aware they took place. The city eventually shut the operation down around 2000 for unlicensed sale of alcohol. But by that point, women had already been disappearing for years, and the farm had established itself, in certain circles, as a place where ordinary rules of society did not apply. Pickton was also widely known locally for traveling to Vancouver's Downtown Eastside to seek out women there. This was not hidden behavior. People in the neighborhood were aware of it. Some law enforcement officers who patrolled the area recognized his face. He was a known presence. Not as a danger, but as an unremarkable, odd figure who showed up from time to time. That perception held far longer than it should have. He did not look like a threat. He looked like an isolated pig farmer with money and a large property, and that surface impression kept serious scrutiny away from him for years. Vancouver's Downtown Eastside in the 1990s was one of the most economically difficult urban areas in Canada. It was home to a large population of women living in serious poverty, a significant number of them Indigenous, many managing long-term dependency challenges, many engaged in street-level survival work with no safety net beneath them. These women existed largely outside the systems, healthcare, legal protection, housing, that most city residents could access without a second thought. Their daily lives required navigating risks that most people never encounter. Beginning in the mid-1990s, women began disappearing from the neighborhood in numbers that families and community groups could not explain through ordinary patterns of movement. Reports were filed. Community organizations began compiling their own lists because the official records felt incomplete and the institutional response felt absent. Indigenous women's organizations raised the alarm with specific urgency. The disappearances were not scattered or random. They were concentrated, patterned, and continuing to grow. Between 1995 and 2001, at least 65 women were formally reported missing from the area. The actual number is almost certainly higher. Some women had no one positioned to notice they were gone. Multiple tips connecting the disappearances to the Pickton farm reached police during this period. In 1998, a detective was made aware of a call to a police tip line specifically naming Robert Pickton. Between 1998 and 1999, 4 separate individuals independently contacted authorities with concerns about the property. One report stated directly that human remains were present on the premises. A warrant was secured. No search was conducted. The file moved on. The women kept disappearing. In 1997, a woman accepted a ride from Robert Pickton. He drove her to the farm at 953 Dominion Avenue. Once she was there, isolated from any help, far from the city, the encounter turned. She was restrained and seriously injured in the assault that followed. In the struggle, she managed to reach the weapon Pickton had been using and turned it on him, injuring him in return. She got off the property, reached the road, flagged down a passing vehicle, and was taken to hospital. Police responded. Pickton was treated at the same hospital facility for his own injuries. She gave a complete statement to investigators. She named her attacker. She described what had happened in detail. Robert Pickton was arrested and formally charged with attempted grievous harm, aggravated assault, and unlawful confinement. In January 1998, Crown prosecutors decided to stay all of the charges. The stated reason given was that the woman's background, her work in street-level survival, and her history of dependency challenges made her, in their assessment, an unreliable witness. The case was closed. Pickton walked out without any consequence. Of the women who disappeared between 1998 and Pickton's eventual arrest in February 2002, investigators later determined that at least 20 were still alive at the point when those charges were stayed. That figure sits at the center of everything that followed, not as an abstraction, but as a specific accounting of what the institutional decision of January 1998 actually cost. By 1998, the scale of the disappearances had become impossible to publicly ignore. Vancouver Police and the RCMP formed a joint task force called Project Amelia, specifically to investigate the missing women cases. In 2001, it was restructured and renamed Project Even-Handed, with a broader mandate and additional investigative resources. The work of systematically reviewing every tip and file that had accumulated over the previous years was enormous. Records handled inconsistently across multiple agencies with poor coordination between them. But one name appeared consistently across every strand of that review: Robert William Pickton. Multiple women had described dangerous encounters with him. Multiple community sources had independently pointed toward 953 Dominion Avenue. The connections had existed for years. What had been absent was the institutional will to assemble them into coordinated action. And that absence had come at an extraordinary cost to the women who were still disappearing while the files sat unreviewed. On February 5th, 2002, police executed a search warrant on the Pickton farm using illegal firearms as the legal entry point, a deliberate approach to gain access to the grounds. Within hours, investigators found personal belongings connected to one of the missing women. A second court order followed the next day. On February 22, 2002, Robert Pickton was formally charged with the first-degree homicide of Serena Abbotsway and Mona Wilson. The search ran for nearly 2 years and involved hundreds of officers. Every inch of the 17-acre property was examined. Buildings, vehicles, equipment, soil. Forensic anthropologists, DNA analysts, and pathologists worked in conditions described by those involved as among the most technically demanding of their careers. The land had processed tens of thousands of pigs over decades, and separating human biological material from animal required analysis of fragments that were, in many cases, extremely small. DNA. Evidence eventually connected at least 33 women to the property. Personal effects belonging to additional women were recovered across the grounds. When Pickton was brought in for formal questioning, he gave investigators nothing. He denied all knowledge of the missing women. When photographs of those who had disappeared were placed before him, his response was described by everyone present as completely flat. Not the flatness of someone managing distress, but of someone for whom the faces produced no reaction of any kind. Police placed a trained undercover RCMP officer inside his cell. The officer had studied Pickton's speech patterns, his references, his manner of engaging in conversation. Everything needed to present as a like-minded person Pickton would trust. Maintaining that persona in close quarters with this man, over an extended period, required both skill and a considerable degree of personal resolve. The operation succeeded. Pickton began talking. He was not cautious. He was, by the accounts of everyone who analyzed the recordings, actively eager to share. In the recorded conversations, Pickton described his actions in terms that forensic psychologists consistently characterized as boastful rather than confessional. He was not releasing a burden. He was presenting what he considered an achievement and expecting recognition for it. When the undercover officer described a method for removing evidence from a scene, Pickton cut him off. He said he knew a better approach. He described the rendering equipment on the farm, industrial machinery designed to process animal remains into base biological material, and the specific role it had served. He spoke about it the way someone might describe solving a practical problem they were proud of. Then came the number, 49. He said it while expressing frustration that he had not reached 50. 50 was the figure he had been working toward. Forensic psychologists reviewing the recordings for the Crown stated that this framing, behavior described as a running total, a personal target missed, was consistent with someone who had wholly removed any recognition of the humanity of the people he was discussing. The count was what mattered. The people in the count did not. In a separate exchange, he compared himself to a figure being unjustly punished. Language revealing that he had constructed an internal story in which he was not the source of harm, but the person being wronged by those investigating him. That self-framing, combined with the boastful accounting of his actions, gave the Crown a coherent and deeply disturbing psychological portrait to place before the jury. Pickton's trial opened in January 2007 at the Supreme Court of British Columbia in New Westminster. Given the volume and complexity of evidence, the Crown divided the 26 charges into 2 separate proceedings. The first covered 6 cases and ran for more than 10 months. one of the longest criminal trials in Canadian legal history. The prosecution anchored its case on three pillars: physical evidence recovered from the farm, including human remains and DNA, linked to multiple women, testimony from witnesses and survivors who had been to the property, and the recorded cell conversations, which place Pickton's own words at the center of the Crown's argument. The defense accepted that harm had occurred on the farm, but argued that the degraded forensic evidence, gathered from land saturated with decades of animal material, could not conclusively establish that Pickton was personally and directly responsible for causing each individual harm. They pointed to the farm's history of large gatherings and the many other individuals who had accessed the property over the years. It was a strategy aimed not at acquittal, but at reducing the degree of the findings. The jury returned its decision on December 9, 2007. Robert Pickton was found responsible on 6 counts of second-degree homicide for Serena Abbotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda Wolfe, Georgina Papin, and Marnie Frey. The jury concluded the evidence did not meet the standard required for first-degree findings, meaning they could not determine to the required legal threshold that each act had been planned and deliberate. For many families, that distinction was one more thing the system had failed to get right. The judge imposed life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum available under Canadian law for a second-degree conviction. The Crown then announced it would not proceed with the remaining 20 charges. Pickton was already serving the maximum available sentence. Further trials would cost tens of millions of dollars and produce no greater legal consequence. For the families of those 20 women whose cases would never be heard in a courtroom, that announcement was not a legal decision. It was one more form of loss. In 2010, British Columbia launched the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry with a mandate to examine how the investigation had been conducted and where it had failed. The inquiry heard from police officers at every level, from families of the women who had disappeared, from community advocates who had been raising alarms for years before any coordinated institutional response emerged, and from survivors who had reported dangerous experiences at the farm and been largely ignored. The findings were direct and damaging. Systemic bias against women in street-level survival, and against Indigenous women specifically, had shaped how tips were assessed, how missing persons reports were prioritized, and how decisions about witness credibility were made throughout the investigation. The 1997 incident, when Pickton was charged and the charges were stayed, had been the clearest opportunity to end the situation years before additional women lost their lives. That moment had been closed by an institutional judgment about whose account was worth believing. Coordination between Vancouver Police and the RCMP had been chronically inadequate. Resources had not matched the scale of the problem. The inquiry issued 63 formal recommendations for reform. This case did not exist in isolation. Indigenous women and girls in Canada are 12 times more likely to go missing or to lose their lives to violence than non-Indigenous women, 16 times more likely than white women. The Pickton case became a catalyst for the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which ran from 2016 to 2019 and gathered testimony from over 2,000 survivors and family members. The final report concluded that the pattern of violence and institutional neglect directed at Indigenous women in Canada constituted genocide. The word was chosen deliberately, to name the scale and to establish a level of accountability that softer language could not carry. The women Robert Pickton was charged in connection with were Serena Abbotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda Wolfe, Georgina Papin, Marnie Frey, Wendy Crawford, Heather Bottomley, Jennifer Furminger, Helen Hallmark, Patricia Johnson, Heather Chinnick, Tanya Holick, Sherry Irving, Ingrid Hall, Diane Rock, Sarah DeVries, Cynthia Felix, Angela Jardine, Diana Melnick, Deborah Jones, Kara Ellis, Tiffany Drew, Kara Koski, Andrea Borhaven, and Jacqueline McDonnell. These are names, not a number attached to a case file. Each belonged to a person with a life, a history, and people who loved them. Serena Abbotsway was 29, described by family as artistic and kind, working toward a more stable future. Mona Wilson was 26, originally from Manitoba, known for keeping her humor in hard circumstances. Andrea Joesbury was 23, and left behind a daughter who would grow up knowing her only through photographs. Marnie Frey was 24, had been in contact with her family, and was making plans. Beyond the 26 formal charges, additional women from the same neighborhood in the same period remain unaccounted for. Their families still have no answers. Some of their disappearances were never formally recorded at all. Following his conviction, Pickton was held at Kent Institution in British Columbia and later transferred to Port Cartier Institution in Quebec. In May 2024, he was attacked by another person at the facility and sustained serious injuries. He did not recover. On May 31st, 2024, Robert William Pickton passed away in hospital. He was 74 years old. For the families of the women he harmed, news of his passing arrived differently for each of them. Some described something close to relief. Others felt that his death had removed the last remaining possibility, however remote, that he might one day provide specific information about women whose remains were never found. Many said that no sentence, no verdict, and no ending in a prison hospital could be proportional to what had been taken from them. They were right. Robert Pickton was convicted on 6 counts and passed away in a prison hospital in May 2024. But the 26 women confirmed in connection with this case, and the many more still unaccounted for, deserve to be remembered by name, not counted as statistics. Their stories exposed failures that went far beyond one man and one farm. Failures of judgment. Failures built on a long-standing institutional decision to treat some lives as less worth protecting than others. Know these cases. Know these names. Share this video if it stayed with you. Subscribe and stay with us. Because these stories matter, and so does what we choose to do with what we learn from them. Stay informed. Stay engaged.